This past spring was an unusual season with weather here in Madison. As the season changed from winter, and it seemed like it was never going to change from winter, but eventually it changed from winter to spring. What happened is that right at the end, really when it was spring, we still got lots of snow, and then all of a sudden, it warmed up very quickly. And what happens during that time is, in an abnormal way, the snow melts fast. And the snow all of a sudden becomes water, filling the streets and the sidewalks. So in our house that's almost 100 years old, our house, when I went down to the basement one day, there was some puddles of water in this one area just sitting there. It wasn't that bad, but significant puddles of water sitting there. And what I realized is that even though we've been living there about 4 or 5 years now, that this season was abnormal. The snow usually doesn't melt that fast, and so even though our house is generally prepared for that kind of water, this season it was so sudden and abnormal that it overwhelmed our house and water was seeping into our basement. Basically, this season revealed the cracks in the foundation of our house that we normally would not see, like during seasons like now. I was thinking about that. There are also changing seasons that we go through in our life, in our relationship with God. There are times when God seems so close, and it's a season of sweetness, and God is so dear, and God seems so real, and everything is good, and worship seems so powerful, but seasons in our life change. And then there are seasons when God seems so far away. It seems like maybe a spiritual drought. Some seasons it's easy to serve God, easy to love people, easy to be a blessing to others, but other seasons come and it can be hard to continue to serve God, to continue to love people. Those people you were loving now seem so difficult. It seems hard to be a blessing to others. And we always go through these changing seasons because circumstances in our life change. Our life stages change. The condition of our hearts change. And there are always changing seasons. And so in the midst of changing seasons, we have to make seasonal choices. As we see David writing in this psalm, what we'll see is that the season has dramatically and suddenly changed in his life. The title of Psalm 63 identifies it as a Psalm of David, and it indicates that it was written when he was in the desert of Judah, the desert. So this was probably a time when he was the king, but he's fleeing and he's running from Absalom, who is his son. And for Absalom, it's an all-out coup d'etat as Absalom is trying to kill David, dethrone him, and take the kingship from him. What a change in season. David had seasons of being the anointed king of Israel. David had seasons of, as a boy, killing Goliath. David had seasons of being used mightily of God and people singing about how the tens of thousands he had killed. Now he's in a very different season where everything seems to have fallen apart and his life is in danger. And we can learn from the seasonal choice here that David makes in the midst of what's going on in this psalm, in this context. So this morning, what I'd like to ask you is, as we talk about this, could you please ponder in your mind what kind of choices you yourself will make as you go through the changing seasons of your own life? Seasons change, life stages change, circumstances change, things change, relationships change. And as you go through those changing seasons, what kinds of seasonal choices will you make in your life? Well, I think there's 3 things we can learn from this passage to help us to think through that. First of all, we're going to talk about remembering God's faithfulness yesterday. Secondly, we'll talk about choosing God's faithfulness today. And then finally, we'll talk about anticipating God's faithfulness tomorrow. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So first of all, Let's think about this idea of remembering God's faithfulness yesterday. Look at verse 6. We see David writing, I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. So David here he's lying in his bed all night, watches of the night. Every watch is a 3-hour segment. So through the watches of the night. So this is like 3 hours, 6 hours at least, probably all night long. He's meditating on God. Perhaps he just cannot sleep. Netflix hasn't been invented yet, so he has nothing else to do to pass the time. So he's just meditating on God. Maybe he's meditating so deeply on God that he cannot sleep because of that. We're not exactly sure, but he's meditating, thinking, dwelling on things going on in his life, and he's thinking about Absalom who is hunting him. Remember, David is on the run. So his heart might be discouraged. His heart could be tired of, man, it is so hard to serve God day after day, month after month, semester after semester, and year after year. And David might be sitting there dwelling on that, laying there just, man, what is this? I'm hiding from my own son who's trying to kill me. And I think what's going on here is David is remembering through the psalm how God has worked in the past, even as he's in this moment of danger. So through his prayer, through the psalm, we see some ways that David remembers God's faithfulness yesterday. We see that he remembers seeing God. In verse 2, he says, so I have looked upon you in the past. I've looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. David remembers how God had worked so mightily and so powerfully in the past, defeating Goliath and overcoming armies and doing all of these things. And he saw God's hand at work so vividly. And he has testimony after testimony of how God used him as the covenant king. He remembers seeing God like this. David remembers worshiping God. Verse 3, my lips will praise you. Verse 4, in your name I will lift up my hands. This is what he's done before. There were times as the covenant king of Israel, anointed by God, he worshiped God. He led the people in worship. He led his nation to be worshipers. He remembers how sweet it was, how amazing it was to be worshiping with the people of God. I think he also remembers enjoying God. Verse 5, he says, my soul will be satisfied with fat and rich food, the best of foods, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips. As the king, he had the best of foods made for him, provided for him, but he's saying that there was nothing that satisfied him as much as God did. All the entertainment and all the affirmation of people and all the other things that we so long for, David was saying that nothing satisfied me as much as God did. And he remembers enjoying God so much. It was so good just to be in his presence and to love God and to know him. And there was nothing better than playing my harp and loving and worshiping God. David is thinking about these things. You know, throughout the Bible, God always seems to call his people to remember. Can we think about that? He always calls his people to remember. I think about in Exodus, God told Moses and the people to remember this day in which you came out of Egypt because you were slaves. You were under the captivity and ruthless rule of Pharaoh as slaves, and I brought you out of Egypt to freedom. I parted the Red Sea so that you could be free. Don't ever forget where you came from. Don't ever forget what I've done. Don't ever forget my faithfulness. And God was imploring his people to remember. God wanted the next generation, as Joshua and the Israelites crossed into the promised land, as they crossed the Jordan River, He told them to take memorial stones and to build this altar so that they would always remember and they would tell their children about what God did to lead them into the promised land. And they were always to remember God who had brought them thus far as they established this altar of stones. Even Jesus told us to remember. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body broken for you." As he establishes the Lord's Supper and he says, "Do this in remembrance of me." So throughout the Bible, throughout history, God is always telling us to remember where we've come from and what he's done, and so that would build faith within us. I don't know about you, but I think it's really hard sometimes to remember, because if you're like me, we're so forgetful. We're so forgetful about how much God provides for us. We're so forgetful about how he opens doors for us. And then what happens? We are here, we look forward, we don't have what we want this, we don't get that, and then we complain and we forget where we've come from. We get frustrated, complain today, forgetting totally about what God has done yesterday. What are some things that you can do to help yourself remember where you've come from yesterday? Maybe for some of you, it's as simple as keeping a journal more and recording testimonies of how God has been working, and then you go back and you read those things and you think, man, I was so worried about this, but God provided. I was so stressed out about this situation in my life, but God made it work out. Man, God is faithful, and we can remember those kinds of testimonies. For me, sometimes what helps is I just stand in my office, because on my bookshelves over there, I have some pictures that I'll probably never get rid of because they remind me of things. This morning, I just took pictures of the picture to show you, but here's one. My senior year, I remember feeling the sense of God's calling to ministry. In my senior year, that call, that feeling became undeniable, and I knew that it was God working in my heart. And so in the midst of my uncertainty, I remember God was so faithful, answering those questions. And now, even when I struggle and I have doubts now, I remember back when I was a senior, and I think about that time when I was doubting and struggling and asking all these questions, and I remember how God led me at that point in my life. I have this picture when I was on staff at a church in Philadelphia called Grace Covenant. It was a really difficult season for me personally. I was struggling maybe with my own identity, my own sins. I was struggling with being poor, not knowing the future, my own failures. But I remember so many things from that period of time, how God opened doors, how God provided, how God was at work. And when I look at that picture just standing in my office sometimes, I remember his faithfulness. Last pick, I think about this picture with the staff I was a part of down in Champaign, Illinois, at a church called Covenant Fellowship Church. It was during the season that God taught me so much. I feel like God was really humbling me, but growing me. I was able to get married during this season. I felt conviction to come to Madison during the season. And God opened many doors during that time. And I remember his faithfulness. And even now, when there's struggles and different things, I remember during that time, God gave me this conviction that we're going to come to Madison to plant this church. And so God calls us and tells us to always remember what he's done. And that's what David is doing. In the midst of the turmoil and trial and difficulty that he's going through, what is he doing? He's choosing and he's remembering God's faithfulness yesterday. And then because he does that, that allows him to make choices and to choose God's faithfulness today. Look at what he does in verse 1. He says, "Oh God, you are my God." Again, think about his circumstances. "Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." This is not where it is lush. It is plentiful. There's so much fertile ground in my life right now. No, this is barren land, barren territory in his life. And so David here is making a choice in the present, but why is he doing that? Is it baseless? No. He's making this choice based in the present, based on his remembering God in the past. So his prayer is declaring present faith in God. Even though it looks so blurry and it looks so uncertain and men are coming to kill him, there's present faith. Longing for God, even though it's a season of dryness where there is no water. Perhaps there's some of us here going through a season like that in your life right now. If you're not going through it now, you will go through it at some point in your life, I promise you. You will feel times when you are spiritually dry. You will feel times when your family is falling apart. You will feel times when your health goes away. You will feel times when you're financially struggling. You will feel times when your heart is just having a hard time. You start to wonder, is serving worth it? Is living for God worth it? Where is God? I don't feel intimacy. He's not very precious. Is he? Am I precious to him? And we have those seasons. But because David, he remembered God's faithfulness in the past, he was able to choose God's faithfulness today in the present. Let me just walk through 4 things that I think David does to do that, to choose God in the present. I think what he does is he chooses by looking for him. Verse 2, so I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and your glory. Remember, David remembers all that God did. And what is he doing? In the midst of this season right now, he is looking for God. He's looking around, trying to see God, how God is working in the midst of his present circumstances. Sometimes it's the most difficult seasons when we look for God when he's not easily found, but we look for God that we might see that we're actually growing the most. You know, I've noticed that there are some spiritual giants like Jonathan Edwards, Charles Spurgeon. When you read their writings, there's always these weird chapters where they just reflect on like the beauty of a leaf or like a flower. And you wonder, why is this in this theological book? But these giants, what they would do is they would reflect and see God in everything around them in their life, including nature. And I think they learned to see God's fingerprints all over the universe. And because of that, they could see God's fingerprints all over their lives as well. When we're going through these kinds of times, choose by looking for him. Look at your present life, and you might not like what's going on, but look and see what God might be up to. You will find him when you're looking for him. Another thing that David does is he chooses by speaking to him. He says, "Oh God, you are my God." David is going through the most hard moment when his life is in danger. And what is he doing? He is speaking to God in prayer. "Oh God, you're my God. Where are you?" I think that's what David's crying out. He knows that in this moment, he doesn't feel like praying. He doesn't feel like trusting in God because nothing seems to make sense in his life. You know, many times we are good at speaking to everyone else but God when we go through stuff. Many times we go from this person and then this person and to this person, and we're trying to hear the answers that we want to hear, and we speak to everyone else in our life but God. There will be seasons when the feeling is not there and you're feeling dry spiritually, but those are the times God is listening and he's waiting for you to speak to him. Speak to him. Cry out to him. Pray to him, for he's listening for your voice during that time. So choose by speaking to him. Have you been speaking to him? Have you been speaking to everyone else but him? Make sure there's moments, prayer life, times when you're driving, walking around where you're talking to God, saying, "God, show yourself to me. God, I choose to trust you." Choose by speaking to him. Finally, I think what David does is he chooses by worshiping him. When you look at verse 3 here, it says, because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I bless you. I will bless you as long as I live. In your name, I will lift up my hands. Now notice here, it doesn't say, I feel like it, so I'm going to lift up my hands. It doesn't say, I feel like it, so I'm going to sing right now. What it says is, I will bless you. I will lift up my hands. So what I picture here in David is with all that is just hovering and crushing down on his life. Who knows when he's going to die? Who knows when Absalom is going to show up? What David is doing is he's maybe in tears, clenching his fist and saying, I will praise you. I will praise you as long as I live. Whether it's another 10 years or whether it's another 10 minutes. And David is choosing to worship God. You know, many times we waver between wallowing in our self-pity. And it's all about me. It's all about what I don't have. It's all about my life. But what David is doing is he's going over here and he's taking his eyes off of himself and he's choosing to worship God. And he's choosing not to look at himself and have pity for himself, but he's choosing to become a worshiper. And he's making that choice. Sometimes all we see is ourselves. And then we end up hopeless. We end up discouraged. We end up depressed in different ways. But if we can take our eyes off of ourselves and we become worshipers, we see there's hope in him. In the most difficult of your seasons, this is what we need to do. Sometimes you have to clench your fist because you know from the past, he's good, he's faithful. Sometimes you have to clench your fists and say, I will worship you. I will worship all the days of my life. And then our heart changes and our eyes refocus on him and our faith is strengthened. So first, we see David here. What does he do? He remembers God's faithfulness in the past, yesterday. Secondly, then we see how David, because of that, David was able to choose God's faithfulness today in the present season. And then finally, what's beautiful here is that choice leads to David's faith and anticipation of God's faithfulness tomorrow. We're going to read verse 9 to 11 here. It's very interesting what happens. So David is writing. He's on the run. He's a fugitive. And he writes this, but those who seek to destroy my life will go down into the depths of the earth. They shall be given over to the power of the sword. They shall be a portion for jackals. But the king shall rejoice in God. All who swear by him shall exult, for the mouths of liars will be stopped. Now that sounds good, but what's amazing here is when we see the context of what's going on as Absalom, his son, is leading an army chasing after David who's on the run. So we can see the context when we look at 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 9. This is what's happening. What happens? And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended from between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. Do you see this picture? So he's riding along on this mule. He goes under this big oak tree. The branches of the oak catch his head, and then the mule keeps on going, and he's just hanging there by his head on that tree. It's a humorous scene. And then what happens is, if you read on in 2 Samuel, Joab, he comes and stabs him with a spear. And then 10 sword bearers come, stab him again, and finally kill Absalom. And he's thrown into the forest, dead. Now with that context in mind, reread what David wrote here in Psalm 63. Verse 9, just rereading it, But those who seek to destroy my life will go down into the depths of the earth. What happened to Absalom? He was killed, and he was thrown into the forest, into a pit. Beginning of verse 10, they shall be given over to the power of the sword. What happened? Sword bearers come and they kill Absalom. End of verse 10. They shall be a portion or food for jackals, wild animals. 2 Samuel account says that he was put into the forest, and then very likely wild animals would have come and eaten his body. Verse 11, for the mouths of liars will be stopped. Absalom led a deception, led a rebellion through deception, lie after lie to take away the kingship from David, and he is stopped. Now I want you to think about this, please. David writes Psalm 63 anticipating God's faithfulness, and we see how God is faithful against David's enemies. Now, how could David write in such a way with such faith of how God is going to work in the moment that his life is in the most danger? I think, very importantly, because of verses like what he writes in verse 3. In verse 3 of the psalm, he said, your steadfast love is better than life. If you forget everything else that I've talked about today, just wake up right now, okay? He says, your steadfast love is better than life. Now, this idea of steadfast love comes from this Hebrew word known as hesed. Okay, you have to spit and use a lot of air to say it properly. Hesed. Okay, can you just entertain me? Can we say hesed together? 1, 2, 3. Hesed. Right. Good. More air, more breath, more spit. Okay. So hesed love. Now, whenever we see hesed love in the Old Testament, this is not just ordinary love. This is covenantal love. This is love that is unchanging, unwavering, unbreakable. This is love with all of the weight of God's promises and his character and everything he is. This is God's hesed love that is given, that can never be taken back, that is never forsaken, that is never failing. It is hesed love that is faithful until the end, no matter what. It's love that we humanly cannot give, because we cannot give perfectly unconditional love. This is hesed love that God can give to us. And what David knew is that he was in a covenant, hesed love relationship with God, because God was the one who appointed him as king. Yes, this is a desert moment for David. He is being chased by Absalom and others, but even in this dark moment, what does David do? He knows that he's the covenantal king. Hesed love is his. God loves him, has chosen him, is using him with a covenantal hesed love. And because of that hesed love, David knows that God will be faithful until the end. Although it may look bleak now, David knows that God will be faithful. We too are recipients of hesed love, covenantal love. God who covenants with his people, saying, you will be my people and I will be your God. God who sends a Savior, Jesus Christ, to die for us, to lay down his life for us. Hesed love given to fulfill all of God's promises from the Old Testament. And so what does that mean? No matter what season you are in your life, you are always people, if you're in Christ, of hesed love. That means there's always a season of God's faithfulness on the horizon. There is always morning after a difficult night. There is always a new day because of God's Hesed love. We trust in that Hesed love. What are you going through right now? How dark is it? How stormy is it? If you are in Christ, I can say to you, Hesed love pursues your life. You've tried to run away from it. You cannot run away from Hesed love. You think you're going to sin and mess it up. You cannot sin and mess up Hesed love in your life. It is unwavering, steadfast until the end. You cannot out-sin God's Hesed love. That's why in Lamentations it says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Never ceases. The Hesed love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Do you believe that? Because He loves us. No matter what desert we find ourselves in, what season we find ourselves in, and you will find yourself in some difficult seasons at some point in your life, God's Hesed love will always pursue you. In the desert sometimes, God brings us to the desert so that in the desert we can experience the sweetness of His Hesed love that finds us. So as you think about this passage, we need to remember God's faithfulness yesterday. What are you doing to remember? Maybe some journaling, maybe some pictures, maybe just talking about things, maybe just remembering with people. I remember when I was just so clueless, or I was jobless, or I was hopeless, or I was whatever. Just remember those times and remember how God was with you. How God provided. Remember when my sin just seemed so, I couldn't overcome, how God provided. Remember when I was lost spiritually, how God worked. And then we choose God's faithfulness. It's not an empty choosing. It's not a baseless choosing. It is with that past that we remember. And then because of that, we can anticipate God's faithfulness tomorrow. Let me just end with two quick stories. Yesterday was the end of baseball season for my son Daniel. It was actually, in the last month or so, it was actually two different teams that he was on. First was the regular Madison Summer League team that he was on. And then the last final team that he was on was just last month, this Madison All-Star team. Okay, so this is the All-Star team. Like you can potentially make it to the Little League World Series, but not even in his dreams. But that you can potentially make it there, right? Actually, there's a team from Madison, a 16-year-old age group that made it to the Little League World Series. One of 8 American teams playing right now. Anyways, it was exciting for Daniel to be on this team, and you can imagine at the beginning of this little season, right? They get these nicer jerseys. Their names are on the back. It's like, I'm an all-star, and so much excitement. What a season to be a part of. Baseball season's alive. And they were so pumped up being part of this team. But over the last couple of weeks of this tournament, the team lost every single game. They even lost a couple times based on what's called the mercy rule, where if the other team is winning by 15 runs, the game's over. They lost through mercy rule a couple of times. So yesterday, we were in Reedsburg, Wisconsin, which is about an hour north of here, and it was their final game. And they lost the first couple games, so they're trying to encourage kids. So there's a consolation bracket. And so all the teams that lose go to the consolation bracket. So this is the last game of the consolation bracket. And then they lost 17-3 or something like that. So immediately after the game's over, this is the team picture. Look at the kid in the front middle. Even the coaches look kind of, let's not take this picture. I was thinking about this. Team lost every game. The team that we lost to, Wanakee, they were the only other team that lost every other game. So this game would have been to see who loses every game or wins one game, you know? There's a point here. Sometimes we feel like that in our life. We feel like I've had a losing season. We feel like I've been failing God. We feel like I failed in my ministry calling. We feel like I failed spiritually if people knew what I do. We feel like we're just so messed up. But on the other side of this camera are a long row of parents who unconditionally, as much as humanly possible, are waiting and loving their kids, probably taking them to ice cream afterwards to cheer them up, who embrace their kids even after they come off the field like that. I was thinking, that is our relationship with God. No matter what, His Hesed love for us is unwavering, unending. Another quick story. There's a person who used to attend our church maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. Her name's Alice Moon. And she attended our church just one summer as she was here for an internship. A little while back, she was diagnosed with having breast cancer. She's in her mid-20s, I think. Can you imagine? You're in your mid-20s, and all of a sudden, breast cancer is in your life. You're going to chemotherapy, and seasons have changed dramatically in our life. Just a side note, I posted on Facebook, they're having a t-shirt fundraiser. Her theme is Moonwalking Through Cancer, Alice Moon, Moonwalking Through Cancer, if you want to support her. I've been following her blog, and just one post that was really encouraging. And just think about the choices that we make in those seasons. She wrote this: I really do believe that God has control over the whole cancer situation and sends help down to the medical staff, the technology, friends, and family. I don't think God is ever unfair for dropping me in the situation, but I think there is a much bigger picture that I can't wrap my head around. And I believe He's working around the clock in the midst of everyone involved. And I'm so very thankful. That's a choice you have to make. That's a choice, a seasonal choice that she's making, to believe in God's faithful, Hesed love. I want to encourage all of us here. There are many seasons that you're going to face in your life, and some of you are going through it right now. If you forget everything, can you just remember this one verse? Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Hesed love, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases.